So I just want to start off by saying thanks everyone for joining us for another virtual town hall. We're excited to be chatting with you yet again. Hope everyone's doing well. Obviously, things are a bit tense and stressful all over the place right now. So it seemed really important for us to come together and have a conversation as we've been doing for the past few weeks, but to try to take a deeper look at some things that are maybe affecting the community and how we might be able to work within those. So I would like to just a few housekeeping notes. Remember to keep yourself on mute if you're not talking, so there's not a lot of background noise as I hear my train roll by. And if you have a question or would like to contribute to the conversation, please, we absolutely encourage that. There's the chat option down at the bottom. There's also the raise your hand option, so we can stop what we're doing and make sure we call on you to have comments and questions. But we really absolutely love these to be interactive. So please chime in, contribute. We'd love to hear what you have to say, and we'd love to chat with you all. So I think over that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian Johnson, who's going to take over the next section.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Before we start, I kind of want to set some context here. You know, I've struggled a lot with how to start a discussion that would be worthy of the moment. Because when you think about what is occurring right now and you call it a moment, it also shows, I think, some ignorance of, I think, the struggle that comes constantly for Black families and people of color. This is not a moment to them. This is a reality, a constant reality that they live with from the time they're born to the time they die. And it's a moment, and it's a reality. Racial inequity is something that Black families have dealt with for generations upon generations upon generations. And so, you know, how do we approach that discussion as business leaders is really something that I've tried to figure out. I'm really heartened to see, you know, my daughter's second grade class has spent the past week discussing George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. And it's been very interesting to watch the kids kind of struggle to comprehend and come to grips with this idea. And it just is incumbent upon us. It doesn't seem like any of us have where none of us have the option of opting out of difficult conversations. That being said, you know, there are what we tell our children, there are what we tell our friends, and there are what we deal with as business leaders. And what I want to do is talk about how we, as business leaders, understand and deal with the idea that there are going to be conversations coming into our communities, into our offices, even our virtual offices, across our organizations that in the past, I think we've had the luxury of not having go on, that we've sort of pushed to the side, the old politics and religion conversations in the workplace that we've kind of pushed aside. But I don't think that that's going to play anymore. I've watched over the past week as CrossFit CEO had to step down from the company he founded by being very insensitive to the moment on a conference call with employees. I've watched NASCAR talk about removing Confederate flags. Today, Berklee College of Music issued an apology for allowing police to use the restrooms on their campus. It's quite obvious to me, and I'm think to everybody on this call, that we're in a new paradigm when it comes to discussing social justice and social impact in our industry. And so as the leaders of a trade association, our job is to try and help you as business leaders be ready for those discussions and those things that come. And also, I think, look out and say, what are the big pictures here in terms of how our companies and what our companies' roles are in the future in a highly politically engaged culture. And it seems to me that companies that do not understand that social responsibility is part of their DNA are going to be the companies that are left behind. And it's going to start with brain drain. It's going to start with young people not wanting to come to your company because they want to know where your heart is at. So I thought the best way was to start talking on a broader level about social responsibility on a corporate level. Diversity and inclusion, of course, is a key part of this. And I think if any of us have learned anything and you've watched, every single major corporation in the United States has issued a statement condemning racial inequity. And the good ones hopefully are saying that Black Lives Matter. So I will take full responsibility for this statement. MedTech has not, I think, when I go to MedTech conferences, I don't see nearly enough people of color. I also don't see nearly enough women. And I think what I want to do is to start having, not just having conversations, but creating meaningful actions where we can start to acknowledge that we have an issue and to start finding ways to come together to open up our community. This is an amazing, the healthcare technology community is an amazing community. These are great jobs. These are great careers. And we deal with people's lives. And I think it's so incumbent upon us to make sure that everybody who could thrive in this community comes and thrives. So today I've asked Christina Mendoza, Sarah McDonald, and Michelle Fox to join me in a discussion about our corporate social responsibility working group. Because what I'm hoping is to get more of you involved in this aspect of our mission. And I think together we can do a lot better than just issuing statements, having conversations. We can actually create actions and create accountability so that our industry represents our world. Our industry represents our hospitals. So I wanted to, Christina, are you on the call?
Yes. Hey, how are you?
Hey. So Christina, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. I'm going to put you really quickly. I wanted to kind of talk about what we talk about when we talk about the notion of corporate social responsibility and sustainability, and define it for our group here today, so that we can understand a little bit better how this plays within our discussion about diversity and inclusion.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, sustainability and corporate social responsibility is a huge kind of functional area of organizations. It's a huge topic. It encompasses your environmental, your social, your governance. Sometimes people get stuck on that environmental part, but diversity and inclusion and that social and governance aspects have been coming to the forefront for years. And I think now it's important that we kind of give this category of the CSR and sustainability functional area the resources and attention that it needs, because we're not going to be successful in implementing this in our organizations and implementing change within our organizations if CSR, sustainability, and diversity and inclusion aren't integrated. So that's been like the challenge all along with this field, is not having it an add-on, not having it a program off to the side, but really having it built into the culture, which unfortunately cultural change is one of the hardest things to do. But I think just even the onset of the Mass Medic CSR work group and the conversations that are open to have like this are a really good kind of starting point for that. And the other piece that I really like about this field of sustainability and CSR is that it's yes, everyone's kind of looking for that competitive advantage, but we're working towards a common goal, which is really different from a lot of other functional areas or disciplines sometimes. So I think the best thing to do is to share those best practices, see what other people are doing, what's working for them. It's requiring a lot more effort to kind of think about how strategically you want to take this on, and not just kind of put those high level statements on bettering our organizations in this field, but really having a plan and taking action towards it. So that's kind of how I see it integrating into the conversation today.
Yeah, and Christina, I should mention, Christina works for Capaccio, which is a company that works with several MedTech companies to implement these sustainability practices. Christina, how prevalent do you, I don't know how long you've been in this business, and Christina is also one of the key members of our CSR working group, but how prevalent, from your point of view, are CSR functions in MedTech, and what has the growth been like in recent years?
So yeah, we work in a number of different industries, but MedTech is a tricky one because they have a lot to deal with, as you all know, in terms of the regulations and all of kind of the best practices in terms of patient care and kind of hoops to jump through from that perspective. It's been growing for sure, as it has, I think, amongst all industries. I think at the core, it comes down to it because it's MedTech and med device cares about the human at the end. That's really like should be the bigger picture. So that's where the connection has been growing and being made between med device and CSR and sustainability. I will say that it has, I haven't seen it as much of like that leading field for the forefront. There are some amazing companies that are doing some really fantastic programs, but just like overall, compared to some of the more kind of just pure tech companies that have been able to build in that CSR, sustainability, and innovation into their products, MedTech has that challenge of meeting those other requirements from the technical standpoint.
Right. So we have a few very strong leaders in the space. I think we're, one of the companies that I see as a leader and a growing leader, Michelle Fox from Teleflex, Chief Medical Officer. You're on with us today, right? Michelle, I saw you join us.
Yes. Hello, Brian.
Hi, Michelle. Michelle is also part of our CSR working group. And, I just wanted to just talk to you about, maybe you could frame it for us from a company point of view, how you guys look at your responsibility as citizens at Teleflex, and what are the pillars that you see as your responsibility?
Sure, I'd be happy to start there. So as I think, and thank you, by the way, for such a great opening. I think that as we certainly, and Christina spoke to this too, recognize that there is a common mission here, that the MedTech community is focused on improving the quality and of people's lives, and they're doing that through innovation and the improvement in patient care by bringing that innovation to market. So I think that is certainly an area that we can collectively get behind, and I'm excited about CSR, sustainability, because it actually provides some context for our decision making. When there is, and given my role at Teleflex, where I am responsible for clinical trial management and design and other areas, when I think about this as it relates to D&I want to make sure that that we are giving consideration to putting together trials that will benefit the broad population versus what has happened historically, where they've really reflected certain subsets of that population predominantly, and also make sure that we are designing products that are going to have their intended purpose and are products that are being designed for people across the continuum. So I think that's the facet in which all of this actually comes together, which is really exciting and certainly making it a more prominent consideration for the MedTech community.
And, I think we talked about this on a call recently. You said sort of admittedly we're new to a lot of this. And, I think it's important that we all, allow ourselves a bit of fumbling around to find the right words. But how do you feel your efforts kind of flow in your organization? Is it a top-down edict or is it a bottom-up edict when it comes to, hey, are we being good citizens of the world? Are we paying attention to the, who we're reaching? Are we impacting diversity and inclusion in a positive way? Is it in your experience, is it a top-down thing or a bottom-up?
It's actually both, which I appreciate. There's a real grassroots energy around this, and particularly with a lot of our community efforts. That's certainly one of the things that I enjoy at Teleflex, that there is a recognition of the significance of this really across the organization. And that has certainly resulted in there being this being more of a definitive effort as part of a strategic undertaking from a leadership level. So we are absolutely benefiting from both.
Right. Do you think it makes sense for us as an industry to set very specific diversity and inclusion goals as an industry? I mean, I don't know if you set them at Teleflex. I know that several of the large companies have very specific targets when it comes to D&I. I don't know if you guys have, or if you think it's important to do that.
Well, I certainly feel like I'm in still learning phase here, as we've previously discussed. We do have a diversity and inclusion council that is chaired by our CEO. And that is what, in setting those goals is part of our ongoing discussion now. We certainly are giving great consideration to the work that's been done with our ERGs and making sure that all voices are represented as we look at this more formally, I would say. It is top of all of our minds right now, given everything that's transpired. And we're really trying to pay attention, to listen, to learn before, I'd say, setting a more concrete direction so it can truly have the intended benefit.
Great, and I think as I see Jake's comment in the chat bot that only 30% of biotech companies even have a diversity and inclusion program, and certainly, again, this is my comment, not reflective. I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody, but I happen to personally feel that in MedTech, sometimes we hide behind the altruism of our business a little bit too much. The fact that we save lives, that we make such profound impact upon people's lives. I think it's such a mission-driven industry that, towards healing and curing, that sometimes we have, I think, compartmentalized our place in the world. So Sarah McDonald from Life Science Cares, I loved, first of all, an old friend of mine, and I love the work you're doing. I love the work Life Science Cares is doing. I love what you sent out this week. So Life Science Cares is an organization that, I'm on the board of advisors on. It's an organization that helps connect Boston nonprofits, Boston-based, and I think you expanded into Philadelphia too, right? To the life sciences community, so that our life science companies can kind of come out of our shells a little bit more, get out of the lab, and start really impacting our world, and specifically on a very local level, the nonprofits, the community-based organizations. Sarah, why don't you help us a little bit with first of all, I'd love you to summarize what you sent out to your team this week, and then, give us some truth. Tell us what ways can we actually make a concrete impact immediately.
Thanks for having me, Brian. And I'll put a warning on before I speak that I may be a little more heretical in what I say. That's the advantage I have in my platform, not representing one company or one point of view, but trying to really espouse service broadly for our industry. I want to go back to some of your opening remarks, how you referenced the fact that many of our organizations are responding and reacting to a moment in time, which is true, and we've been encouraged by the breadth and depth of those reactions. But in fact, we have to realize that all of the inequity, all of the tension, all of the outrage that we're seeing, in the last few months related to how the pandemic has played out in Greater Boston, and then more recently, how police brutality has really rocked communities around the country. None of that was created in 2020. In fact, what we're really looking at is systemic inequities that are rampant through the infrastructure of our communities, whether it's how really fragile our food system is, or how the technology and digital divide in a city like Greater Boston remains persistent for Black and Brown communities. These are things that existed, long before these moments, and are going to exist long after these moments unless we really pause and look at how we can use the leverage of our companies, of our employees, to make some systemic changes, to give people opportunity to know us, to work for us, to work with us, and moving Greater Boston forward. So we have been responding to companies in that moment and just encouraging them to look at the community organizations that have existed for decades that are doing that systemic work. If you are interested in hiring diverse talent, look at a Bottom Line or a Year Up, which is completely focused and has been on building that opportunity for low-income or minority youth in Greater Boston to get into a variety of industries. If you are interested in ensuring that people have access to their basic needs, look at an entity like the Greater Boston Food Bank or Food for Free in Cambridge, which are really the infrastructure by which people who can't go to the grocery store and write a check, or frankly put a credit card down for whatever they need, access the food that they need on a regular basis. And don't recreate the wheel. Rest assured that there are valid, impactful, actionable organizations operating in the community that can help you direct all of the energy and enthusiasm that you're seeing from your employees at this moment. And I'll just add one last thing, which is you can't really do this wrong if you are approaching community engagement with a little bit of humility, with learning mindset, with an open heart. You can't really do too much damage by committing your time or talent or treasure to an organization that's operating in the community. It will have a varying level of effect, but you can be pretty sure that you haven't made the world a better place by thinking about your corporate social responsibility.
All right. So tell us just a little more background on Life Science Cares, because it's an organization that I just think is really great, because it helps busy people be impactful in their communities. And I just wanted to make sure that you have a chance to talk about what you guys do on a sort of broader, more operational level, and if people can get involved.
Yeah,
And then maybe a little
sure.
bit about Project On-Ramp really quick too.
Yeah, absolutely. So Life Science Cares was founded in 2016 as essentially a platform for the broader life science industry to come together around a mission of fighting poverty in Greater Boston. So we are squarely a middleman, but we found an important middleman to help harness the industry towards greater good. We raise money from companies and employees in the industry and make grants through a competitive process where we take on the due diligence of vetting nonprofit organizations, providing basic human survival, education, and economic opportunity in Greater Boston. And beyond making those financial contributions, we then sit with those nonprofit partners and say, how else can you use the industry's resource? We have so much time and talent that can really be put to good use in our industry. And so for our partners, that could look like volunteers to cook and serve breakfast at a homeless shelter, or it could be a team of marketing professionals reviewing a marketing plan for a new human service organization. We're really about building those opportunities and those relationships with community organizations to make it easy for companies' employees to plug in. You referenced Project On-Ramp, which is a program near and dear to my heart and something we're talking about a lot in the last couple of weeks. Project On-Ramp is a summer internship program that gives students who are first generation in their family to go to college or from a low-income background the first opportunity to work in life sciences. Project On-Ramp sources students through a nonprofit called Bottom Line that provides students all the training and support they need to show up and be successful in an internship. And Project On-Ramp finds companies that are interested in taking on talent that may be non-traditional to give them that first opportunity. As you can imagine, the summer internship program looks a little bit different this year in that we're seeing most of the interns this way as opposed to in person. But we do have 30 on-ramp scholars that are across about 18 or 19 different companies, almost entirely doing remote projects and adding value to their companies, and coming together every other week as a cohort to build their network and share some of their experiences. I'll tease, because we haven't quite figured this out, but again, seizing the moment, we are looking at expanding On-Ramp into something more year-round, probably not full-time internships, as most of these students don't have the opportunity to just time out from school or work year-round. But the chance of doing project-based or part-time internships the fall semester over winter break and into the spring. So if folks are thinking about how to find and give an opportunity to a well-deserving young man or woman, we can help.
That's great. I mean, I would encourage anybody, right? If you're going to take the moment to think about these issues, about your place in systemic racial inequity, if you want to, if anything that sparks you into opening the door to somebody who you know, opening your mind, opening the door to a young man or woman of color who may never have considered the MedTech industry, what a great opportunity to do it right now. I mean, what a great opportunity. So let's put our money where our mouth is. And, this is, not nearly enough time really to dive into these issues, which is why I make the promise that we as well as an association will not just have a moment. We're gonna ingrain this into our DNA. And, I think, like Sarah said, and as I sort of alluded to in the beginning, there is so much that we feel is unprecedented about the last few months of this pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think, to me, the thing that makes me the most outraged and the most heartbroken is that we go through this unprecedented exercise only to find that the same people that are dying and most impacted by this are the same people who the healthcare system is failing, frankly. And the other thing that I find really inspiring, that I, on the other hand, is the thing that I've learned the most from this pandemic is that we don't need to wait for our leaders to show us the way. We can really build ourselves the world we want. We did it here in Massachusetts without, the help from the federal government. By and large, without guidance from the top, we have managed to withstand a heck of a haymaker from COVID-19. Our hospital systems withstood it, and they withstood it because of everyday heroes taking the reins and making things happen. So I want to thank you for a little bit of your time today to talk about this. And I want to make the promise that we're going to continue this. This is not just going to be a one-off conversation. This is not a time to just make a statement, to get on the record and go. Rachel, I don't know if we had any questions that came in, but I know we have a couple other things on the docket that we wanted to get to today.
Yeah, no questions. Shirley, just want to bring up, thank you so much for posting that comment in the chat bot. I think that is a really great topic, and it's something that's really important to think about, and not something that had come to my mind immediately. I think that we can absolutely help make those connections and open up that wall, right? And you're absolutely right that there is a wall there, and it's hard to understand how to get involved in those opportunities and how people can kind of push past that initial process. So I think that's absolutely something, Brian, I'm not sure if you're taking a look at it, but I think that's absolutely something that we could plan a session around, and trying to understand how to make those connections and really open up that conversation, because I think that's a really important one.
We will absolutely have those conversations, and let's make sure to bring in as many different viewpoints as we can here.
Absolutely. And Sarah, thank you for posting the information on OnRamp in the chat bot. So everybody, if you need the opportunity or are interested, I think it sounds like a great opportunity. As Brian said, this is a topic that deserves so much time. This was just a kind of a high level, let's get the conversation started. So Michelle, Christina, Sarah, thank you so much for help kind of starting us in this effort. Brian, thanks for making sure it was a priority for us to talk about today and to continue talking about. So please, everyone, as you have thoughts, ideas, questions, our emails are out there. We want people to be as involved in this conversation as possible. If it's just two people talking about it, then it's not a conversation, right? It's two people spouting off. What we need is the community to get involved and say, this is what I'm seeing. This is where my concerns are. These are my questions. Here's my hesitations. Sarah, thank you so much for pointing out, you can't really screw it up, right? If your heart's in the right place and you want to help, then there are ways that you can be really effective with communities and organizations that already exist. So don't try to recreate the wheel if you don't have to. Look to work with organizations that are already making a difference. So I think it's been really helpful for me. So thank you all for taking the time to chat about this.
Okay.
So
and Sarah, would you mind putting in the other links? I'm sorry, Rachel, would you mind putting in the other links up to the organizations you talked about? I know you said put in Project OnRamp, you put in Life Science Cares, but there were two organizations you mentioned.
Sure.
Thank you. I'll shut up now, Rachel. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. We've got time. But I did want to make sure we had time to cover our other topic, because our other topic, while completely different, is incredibly relevant for what is going on currently, right? So we've moved from one pandemic into another social opportunity, and now we're kind of shifting back to pandemic response again. But I'm sure a lot of you have seen the guidance has come out about elective surgeries and what's going to be required in hospitals as these surgeries start to take place again. We thought it would be a great opportunity to have Jeff Stoll from KPMG come and talk about some of the things that they're seeing in their organization as groups try to get basically back into the hospital, right? And as things are going on. So Jeff, if you're on the line, would you share your screen and take over?
Sure, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Sounds great.
Great.
And you should be able to use the share screen at the bottom if you'd like.
Yep, it's just taking a moment to process. Let me know when everybody can see my presentation.
We can see it.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for having me to discuss the impact of COVID on on the medical device industry and some of the some of the things that we're seeing in terms of how people are thinking of responding, but also I think a lot of the considerations to be thinking about because it's such a multifaceted issue as you think about how to respond and get back to serving hospitals and ambulatory care clinics. So maybe just as some key themes. One of the things I think that we see in terms of who's going to be coming through this well and managing it well is companies that really have had strong balance sheets, but also have creative management to really think about how do you better serve your customers as there's going to be a lot of market unevenness, both in the U.S. but globally, as we think about the COVID pandemic. Obviously, there's no vaccine today. The therapeutic options have some limitations for preventing severe COVID disease, and so under even the most aggressive scenario, most likely we won't have a vaccine until maybe January or February in terms that's broadly accessible to the population, meaning that social restrictions, meaning that the chances of reinfections and large ones are a higher probability, which can then have implications for how hospitals are serving patients, particularly around elective surgeries, and then what that the downstream effect then that will have with the medical device industry. And so really that highlights the idea that COVID has really created a new reality. And it's really a rapidly changing landscape. How companies were behaving in March was different than April, then different in May and June. And really, as I've talked to many of my clients in the med device space, they're still ramping up and thinking through their customer strategy, their supply chain strategies for how to best serve their customers during this time. And new information inputs are happening all the time as people are really trying to come up with the best strategy to address the market. The other key issue here is health policies at the local level can be different. They're not the same across all states and locales, and that all has obviously implications for elective surgeries. There are also new market constraints and triggers to the degree elective procedures will return. And I think one of the big ones that we'll talk about today is not just what's happening from a hospital profitability standpoint, but also what's the psychological impact. And by psychological, I mean how that really then ties to people's behavior for wanting to pursue elective procedures. Obviously, some electives are not really as deferrable as others, but the scenario that I use routinely with my clients is, if you are an elderly person who needs a knee or hip replacement, as you're weighing the pros and cons and the risk reward, so to speak, of going into a hospital, particularly if there's a COVID outbreak, do you delay going for that type of procedure? And even if it means being in a wheelchair for a longer period of time, I think we've all met people who are more on the fear side of things, and then people who are also on the more cavalier side of things. So it's all that I think bakes out to a population that's really mixed in terms of their willingness to go pursue procedures. And that obviously has implications for the ability for the number of elective procedures by type to potentially return. And I think the last point is this event has really created an opportunity for all medical device companies really to think more creatively about their commercial model, their supply chain models, and how do they lean in to their customers to really help them, not just get back to work, but in some cases, maybe particularly the smaller hospital systems or ambulatory care clinics that maybe weren't as healthy financially. Are there ways for you to lean in and come up with creative solutions for them to really not survive through this and still be able to serve patients? And this slide is a slide that we actually developed back in March, and as we started having these discussions, and we're really in this phase 2 period, just to highlight that part here, where the cases have stabilized. We are beginning to see flare-ups, unfortunately, already, even though we just started reopening up key parts of the economy, and parks and things like that. But overall, I think while there's been a quick snapback in some parts of the economy, clearly there's going to be depressed demand for certain things that are non-essential, while we believe there's a prioritization of certain types of medical procedures, again, that will be variable state by state, population by population type, elective surgery by elective surgery type, depending on lots of different factors. And I'll get into some of those in a little bit. And then we'll continue to have to operate under these, safety precautions, which means the way we would typically do things, particularly in terms of the volume of procedures or the number of patients able to be seen per day, all those things become, more involved in terms of the restrictions, and obviously that then has implications for how fast you can process things. So it obviously slows everything down. So there's a big weight that's on all of our shoulders as we go through this. And then economic implications. This is, again, we're going to see a lot of variability. There's going to be certain communities that are really going to see perhaps permanent economic downturn. Some of the projects, for example, that we're seeing at KPMG is trying to assess flight from certain types of cities and locations where there were major outbreaks and where people have decided that, I want to start a family or whatever it might be. I'm not sure being in a city, particularly if there's going to be more pandemics coming down the road, is the best place to be. So things like that are factors that may fundamentally change the size of accounts for our medical device clients, as there may be fewer patients in certain locations that they serve. So things like that are macroeconomic events that are still playing out. Some of these things may happen for sure. Some of these things may be concerns that certain cities have that may not fully come to fruition, but we very much are in that transition period. And then, of course, the other piece is, while we've had some semi-positive job reports, and to link it back to the last discussion, obviously we saw an uptick in jobs for the white community, but then we saw a continued suppression in Hispanic and Black communities in terms of jobless claims. Last week, I believe it was, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago. I apologize for the time frame there. But there's going to be an unevenness on that side of things, and that directly impacts the number of people who can have health plans that can afford to pursue certain medical procedures. And again, that may be an ongoing suppression that the industry has to deal with. So there's a lot to kind of think through and manage if you're a medical device company, as you think about how you're going to address the market, kind of keep yourself profitable and have revenue coming in as you navigate a very uneven market. While New York may open up today, that might be the next place where a reinfection happens that shuts it down again, while then you're needing to manage your supply chain to get back out to Cincinnati, where maybe it hasn't reoccurred. Just being able to have that nimbleness is going to be essential to success. The slide 4 here is a framework that KPMG came up with. Again, I think this is sort of in the mid to late March, and I think it's really endured quite well in terms of thinking about how the economic return for different sectors and industries will be very different. Obviously, if you watch the stock market, which seems to be in some ways really unconnected to Main Street, certain companies have just soared. Certainly, tech has seen a lot of surge on the right-hand corner, and I'll show some examples of this in a minute. But then, you've seen other industries like hotels and airlines industry obviously going through a hard reset, where things may be permanently changed for those industries moving forward. And then on the bottom part, where we have modified bow and transformed to reemerge, that's where we see hospitals and medical device industries. And we've sort of plotted them directionally here. This is not quantitative data. We have versions of this that get more quantitative, but just directionally, this is how we kind of see the world by industry playing out, the type of recoveries we should expect by industry. And you'll notice on here, we have MedTech listed twice, and we also have pharma listed twice on here. And I think there's a very good reason why we have that. So as we think about the return of the economy and the types of companies that will likely see a quicker rebound versus the type of companies that will see a slower rebound, it really is a bimodal. And this is a little bit arbitrary, I realize, because a lot of people have hybrid portfolios with lots of different types of devices. But depending on the degree you're exposed to one type of portfolio versus another, really will have implications on how quickly your company returns. And so specifically, pharmaceutical companies and med device companies that are more focused on sort of essential procedures that aren't, deferrable, or essential medicines that really are tied to survival and people, and the ability for people to function. Those procedures and medicines either haven't seen much of a downturn. So think about your emergency procedures, or they've seen a modest sort of decline. So the less deferrable the procedure, the less of an impact has happened. Although certain things, for example, in the cardio space, certainly have seen a decline. And so you've seen more medical management to try to buy time for patients. However, things that are more deferrable are going to see a slower response. And as we've talked with lots of different clients on what they've seen and experienced, we very much are seeing that bimodal experience across the industry. And as we think about this, and from the customer perspective, this is really the tail that wags the dog in many ways, which is the ability for medical device customers to bounce back is really central to the ability of the medical device industry to bounce back. And obviously, one of the trends we saw during COVID was the halting of elective surgeries. Small to mid-sized health systems, as we've modeled this out and actually spoke to them, may struggle with being solvent as they go through this experience. Even as elective surgeries begin to open up, as I mentioned earlier, we think there's a psychological component to this, and there may be still a limitation of a number of patient referrals for certain procedures. So we'll really see that as a potential drag on the medical device industry by certain types of procedures. Again, we think that during the crisis, we saw anywhere in a volume change from anywhere from 10% on certain types down to well below 50% to almost zero in certain areas occurring. So it's been pretty dramatic depending on the type of company, type of portfolio, and type of response. Obviously, the U.S. government has stepped in with a lot of relief packages, and this should help to some degree. Although in our conversations with different hospital groups across the country, not everybody was able to access this, and it wasn't enough for certain hospital systems and ambulatory care clinics to really survive this. So it's going to be a very interesting next 3 to 4 months to see how quickly different systems are able to bounce back and take advantage of any stimulus they receive. I'm not going to spend too much time on this time, but this is basically, I think most people that are on the call are familiar with this, what's on the slide here. Obviously, the federal government has issued guidance on states reopening. States then have their own authorities to be more specific on local facilities for elective procedures and the management of that. Medical associations obviously have provided a lot of input. And then individual health systems have to sort of make their own decisions about what they believe is the safe and appropriate way to return. But these are sort of the major starting factors for how this is going to go over the next 12 to 24 months, depending on when vaccines are sort of widely adopted. And the interplay between these things is potentially can create some chaos. We've seen that sort of real time with our federal government intersecting with state governments and what that means. So unfortunately, that's the world we live in. But I think that means, from a medical device standpoint, really having clarity on how you're going to be serving your customers in your individual states and how you can best help them be nimble through this becomes sort of an essential factor for success. And to kind of give you a sense of what the customer's going through, this is a modeling exercise that we went through in March to really say, all right, we've got real data across multiple hospitals that are either small to medium size and also the ambulatory care clinics. Let's come up with some archetypes and what we are going to predict is going to happen in April and May, and potentially further along as there's a halting of elective procedures. So this is real data that we've then forecasted out, and you can see that if you think about the elective procedure type versus non-elective percentage of procedures that are sort of made out on the left side of the chart here, the ambulatory care centers really are heavily reliant on those elective. Where your small to medium-sized hospitals, it's much more of a variable mixed bag. It's sort of, for some, it's more of a 50-50 or 40-60 split, as you see here. Others, it varies quite degree depending on the type of hospital. But overall, directionally, this is what the picture looks like. And then if you look at the contribution of margin that elective procedures provide to those groups, you can see it's a significant portion of the contribution. So even though they may only for a small hospital make up 43% of the procedures and payment types, the fall off on the other side in terms of how much they are adding to the margin is quite significant if you look at the EBITDA there. And so if you model this forward over time and you think about reduced elective procedures by hospital type and ambulatory care type, we basically have sort of survival curves here. And you can see that it falls off pretty quick depending on the mix. And so the key point that I guess we're trying to drive home here is as these systems try to come back to profitability, they may be in some very difficult situations around what do they prioritize. There's a limited number of surgical suites that they have. There's a large swath of patients that they need to address. How do you begin to return to profitability as quickly as possible so you can remain solvent? Becomes a big question for many of these systems. And just to highlight this, because most of our clients are, and I think most of the groups on the phone are global companies, that we're seeing this real time globally also. So this is not just obviously a U.S. issue, but the fall off of elective surgeries and cancellations of surgeries has been a global issue. So there's no place to hide, so to speak, from this. It's everywhere. And so when we think about the dynamics that we think our clients that are in the hospital space are going through, really while there was already a transition happening in terms of how budget impact models were being thought through and the value of different drivers for why you might purchase a certain medical device versus another, we think that the pressure of COVID really is creating a significant shift overall in terms of how that purchasing behavior is going to occur. And so if you see the physician preference model, I would say that was the older model. Again, I'm speaking in generalities here. There were some systems that were already very cost conscious and driven by administrators who were really strict on their budget impact models and how they would purchase devices. But more broadly speaking, there was still a physician influence model that was very strong throughout the industry. We think this is going to change. That's not to say that physician voice is going to go away. However, the ability to identify similar products that are lower cost, there's going to be a massive emphasis on, right? They're going to try to find profitability and margin improvement every place they can in order to stay viable and to return to profitability as soon as possible. So as you think about the discussions that medical device companies are going to be getting into as they think about their next set of contracts and how they're going to serve these clients, it really is going to become about who can fulfill their any pent-up demand that they may have from the delay of procedures. So can you be a reliable source, right? No matter how many procedures they have. Who can be flexible as they may have to be turning on and off and make sure that they still have ready supply as soon as they're ready to go again. But then who's also being most cost conscious in their ability to provide that. And that may be have to be really new creative ways of thinking about contracting. Maybe there's a time horizon on reduced cost of certain types of devices in order to help your customers get back. Those are key things that we think are actively playing out now and will be playing out over the next 12 to 24 months. To put a little more color on the bone here, when we think about the type of procedures, this chart we've mapped out the ones, and this is not exhaustive obviously, but we're trying to kind of hit key categories. When you think about the types that are less deferrable versus more deferrable and the ability for some to return, this is sort of a hodgepodge of different types that we think will play out in terms of things that should return more quickly and things that are likely to be slower to return. Obviously, there's varying degrees across all these things. There can be very urgent spine surgical procedures, but broadly speaking, this is how we think the world is going to play out from a deferrability standpoint. And I mentioned the psychological impact. And so we've got a few more slides related to this, but I only brought one for today that we really start thinking about in terms of what's going to enable different types of patients to return as it relates to economic recovery and some enabling factors versus constraining factors. Obviously, in the media and for some people, when you speak to them, everybody's waiting for that vaccine. It's almost treated as a silver bullet for everything, for everybody to return to normal or pre-COVID behaviors. And it's interesting because the advent of remdesivir and its ability to potentially have a significant impact on taking the top off of the disease, so to speak, so it's less deadly, less severe outcomes of severe disease, hasn't seemed to resonate as much, as at least from the research we've done and speaking to different individuals. Although it should. I realize part of that issue is there hasn't been broad access to that product as soon, but we think that's going to be an important that dynamic and the eventual belief in therapeutics to prevent severe disease will be in a continuing story, particularly as that regimen becomes more complex, as other drugs get approved. That should be something that enables society to feel more free during this time period. We do see these three different economic scenarios you can see on the left side. From our point of view at this point, KPMG, obviously this keeps evolving. We see sort of a modified swoosh or a bumpy swoosh being the most likely recovery standpoint. And you can see as we look at the factors that will be enabling there, one of them will be this first batch of vaccines. So think of AstraZeneca, Moderna, Pfizer as three examples that seem to be the most quickly emerging. Assuming those three are able to be successful through July and September and August and potentially getting an approval in that late October, November time period, then with supply chains needing to gear up, manufacturing needing to gear up, that likely could mean a quicker return. And that would mean sort of a January, February, March time period where we would see more of society feeling free again because more people have been vaccinated and ready to go. So that's our current hope scenario, I guess, that we believe is highly likely. That said, we're talking about vaccines that haven't historically had great probabilities of success. But that said, we are also in a new era of technology in the drug development space. So there's a interesting intersection happening there. Obviously, we also believe serological testing is another key component, and also just the government state policies and how well those policies are adhered to in terms of get back to work programs and thinking about individual employers and how they're going to manage their employees through. I realize I'm running out of time, so let me just zoom ahead. I think my screen froze. I think one of the key things that I mentioned in the beginning was supply chain response. Here we've kind of mapped out what we think are sort of the important things for medical device companies really to be thinking about. Is scenario thinking first and foremost. How are you thinking about the different scenarios that could occur across not only the U.S. but globally, and how are you going to begin to think about having the type of control that's going to create the nimbleness for you to meet different demand scenarios where hospitals that are literally potentially within 50 miles of each other could have very different responses to outbreaks. And so how are you going to be able to have that local control to meet the surging demand in one location, the stopping demand in other locations? Really, that's how we think about creating resiliency. So you got those demand scenarios and inventory strategies in place to be able to meet that demand. And then again, thinking about this as adapting to the new normal. This may be something that continues on. This is just the first strand of COVID-19 that our society is dealing with. This is going to mutate. Everybody talks about this being something that's a part of our flu season now. Does that mean the next mutation of this is going to be similar enough where we have enough herd immunity that it isn't as deadly, or does this mutate to something that's very different and creates another pandemic in the next 2 or 3 years? So don't think of this as a short-term solution. Think of this as an emergency solution that you need to have ongoing so you can be nimble regardless of how the pandemic evolves. I realize we're out of time, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer.
Thanks, Jeff. I think that's really important. I'm so glad you touched on kind of being agile and being nimble. I think there are probably there's another conversation to be had about how to do that, and some tips on keeping that, right? How do you get that flexibility if it's not been in your business model before, and then how do you maintain it? I think are really important things. And we've heard that a bit from folks as they try to rethink business models. There was definitely a request from the audience for slides. So I think people would love to kind of spend some more time with this, but I don't want to cut anybody off. If there are any questions, feel free to chime up, and if not, we'll end things.
Hey, Rachel, I have one quick question. This is Brian. Jeff, so I mean, the probability of a second wave is still very high, but the initial shock to the system, do you guys anticipate that we could experience that again, or having sort of gone through the first wave of this, that maybe we won't see as deep peaks and valleys, or deep valleys, right? I mean, it seems like people, yeah.
It's a complicated and really good question, right? So there's so many factors that get into thinking about that. If the data that's emerging ends up being relatively true, that the current strain of COVID has mutated to a less severe form, therefore everybody's concern about getting COVID should be less of a risk, right? If that kind of picture begins to evolve and we get the vaccines, the first batch of vaccines out, I think, yes, the bottom that we saw in sort of the April-May time period probably was the bottom. If this thing mutates, which it can, and becomes more severe again, during, let's say, in the February time period, just as the vaccines are coming out, and then the vaccines are now only, instead of being 80% getting response rates or 55% response rates, you're now at 20% response rates, you can see a very different picture again, right? I think most of us believe that we probably have seen the bottom. I think there's also an element that a good portion of our population in the U.S. is sick and tired of, and they're ready to get back. At least in my neighborhood, people are out almost acting like there's nothing going on. But then I think that becomes very different when they go to the grocery store. But at least in the neighborhood, people aren't thinking about social distancing. They're not wearing masks anymore. People are just out. So, and I think that's not unique to my neighborhood. I think that's, if you look across the U.S., people are just sick and tired of it. So that has some implications in terms of how quickly people want to get back and be economically involved again. But that also means it could increase our risk for another infection, and a big one, right? So yeah. I think there's a lot of variables to that. I think our base case is we've seen the bottom, and this will continue to get better.
Well, I sure hope so. I hadn't even thought of that worst case scenario. Thanks for that.
Sorry, if you ever need a bad worst case scenario, I have several.
I just stopped drinking every night, so that's not fair. But I appreciate it. And then just any anecdotal data. I mean, if the states that opened up earlier, are those hospital systems, do we have any idea where they're at in terms of capacity, in terms of procedure volume?
Yeah, I don't have anything off the shelf. And in full disclosure, I'm actually mid-project right now looking at this very issue. So in a week, I'll probably have an answer that's specific to that. In the initial data, though, we have a big data analytics group that looked at this. It's extremely variable across the country. Some hospitals really saw a significant impact. Other hospitals continued forward pretty well. So it's really variable state by state, city by city, town by town.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. I think at that, we will say thanks everyone for joining us. And thank you, Jeff. That was fantastic. We'll make sure to send out the slides, and please keep contributing to the conversation. Email us, shoot us a note on LinkedIn, whatever's comfortable. We'd love to chat more about the topics today.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.